Go ahead. So, hi everyone. Apologies for that technical fault. We are joined now by Dr. Josh Frenzel from Washington, D.C., who is giving us his Washingtonian perspective on the recent public pension investment dynamics. Josh, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Nick. It's good to be with you this morning, right outside of Washington. My name is Josh Frenzel with the Mission Square Research Institute. Just by way of background, we're a nonpartisan, apolitical research entity within Mission Square Retirement that focuses broadly on helping states and localities be effective employers. And by the way we do that is we do a lot of research in the state and local pension and defined contribution space in the United States for state and local employees. We do a lot in healthcare and financial wellness. And then also we actively track the changing dynamics of the public sector workforce around the country. So I wanted to just take a few minutes of your time this morning or this afternoon or this evening, wherever you're calling in from, to talk about some trends we're seeing from our public plans database. Now, for those of you on the call this morning, the public plans database is a freely available database to anyone on the call. It's available via publicplansdata.org. And it essentially tracks the top 200 state and local pension systems around the country, which represent about 95% of all public pension assets and members. I'd encourage you after the call to visit publicplansdata.org. And I put in the chat feature on Zoom our most recent briefing document that comes from this, where we actively track the funded status, the contributions, investment makeup, all the main characteristics of the plans. And so this is the most recent briefing document we released about 3 weeks ago or so. So as it pertains to one of the features of the public plans database is we're able to track, using comprehensive annual financial reports of all 200 plans and actuarial evaluations, a whole range of attributes of the plans. And I wanted to just highlight a couple of trends as it pertains to ESG and sort of the topic today. So the public plans database is a joint project between our institute, Boston College's Center for Retirement Research, the National Association of State Retirement Administrators, which represent all of the major state retirement administrators around the country, and now the Government Finance Officers Association, which are the finance officers in the United States. And an interesting aspect of when our colleagues at the Boston College looked at the largest plans in the public plans database, they found that approximately the overall state and local pension sector is about $5 trillion in assets under management total. Of that $5 trillion, about $3 trillion are being invested through a lens of ESG. And now when you sort of peel back the onion layers a little bit more, about 2/3 of the plans in the public plans database have some sort of ESG requirement, at least to be evaluated based on ESG attributes. And this is either directly linked to state statute, but more often than not is linked to the investment policy statements of these plans as well. Now, I say this because 2/3 is while it's not as high as other countries, perhaps, is rather large relative to a lot of the attention that a smaller number of plans get throughout the course, around the country. A lot of attention is given to plans in California, New York City, Colorado, Connecticut, Maine, and Washington, D.C. But there are a lot more plans that are using an ESG lens, either through their investment policy statements or state statute. I know that Nick has other speakers later today that likely will talk about the U.S. Department of Labor guidance and sort of how that affects ESG investment across all plans, but including public plans. Even though they're not directly governed by Department of Labor, they often take the lead, take the Department of Labor guidance as best practice. And so there still is a bit of lack of clarity about how you balance the intersection between ESG and fiduciary duties. And I know that others will get into that later. But we're continuing to see an uptick in, at minimum, the ESG lens that's applied to, like I said, the majority of the $5 trillion of assets under management for state and local plans. Before I turn the mic over to my other colleagues on the call, you'll see in the briefing document that I posted in the chat, as we emerged from the pandemic, we wanted to look at sort of how public plans fared throughout the course of the past year and a half, 2 years. And it's a relatively good news story. Funded ratios have been relatively stable over the past couple of years. 8 and 10 plans paid at least 90% of the required contributions. As you'll see from the document, also, we continue to see a diversification in terms of investment makeup, and with alternative investments making up a larger portion of the overall investment makeup of public plans. But at the same time, to reflect sort of longer term expectations regarding equity markets and the like, we're seeing a continued decline in the assumed rate of return going forward, which will be interesting to keep an eye on as well. Finally, before I turn the floor back over to Nick, I wanted to also highlight that we continue to do a lot of work in the financial wellness space. We sort of take the view, of, financial wellness and financial literacy have been the focus, as many of you on the call today know, has been the focus of for private sector employees and the like. But what we're trying to do is really understand the sweet spot between the benefits and compensation of state and local employees, about 20 million employees throughout the U.S., and sort of their financial wellness and financial literacy needs. It's an area, it's a topic that's often been overlooked historically. And so I'd encourage you to visit slge.org, our website. We're doing a lot in terms of understanding whether or not these employees have access to financial wellness. If they don't, would they prefer a financial wellness program? And if so, what topics are covered? Are they topics that are solely bound to the benefits and compensation directly attached to their public employer, or is it more a holistic program? And so we actually have a grants program that we're doing with our colleagues at the International Public Management Association for Human Resources, which are the HR directors, and the National Association of State Treasurers, so the treasurers of all 50 states, along with the Wells Fargo Foundation, to provide grants to 23 governments around the country, and that they just concluded right now. And so we're now analyzing what's worked well in terms of establishing financial wellness programs for public sector workers in the United States. So I'd encourage you to visit slge.org in the weeks and months ahead, because we'll be providing more data and information on sort of what's working well. Well, at least what we're seeing is working well, and from a financial wellness perspective, that very well could be scaled up to other environments around the country. And quite frankly, we want to learn from all of you. So if you have good models or good samples of what's going on well in terms of financial wellness in your jurisdictions, please reach out. I'd love to hear from you. So Nick, thank you for the time my time this morning.
Thank you, Josh.
It's always great
Thank
to
you,
talk
Josh.
to you.
And I want to apologize for these technical difficulties, because we're doing a hybrid conference here today. And because we have 25 different geographic sites, it proved a technological challenge to do things that way, but it's working quite well now. Thank you, Josh. And I want to ask you to stay online, because maybe you want to make some comments. Domenico Miniacca in Doha, Qatar, is having connection issues of his own. So we will join him later on, but not in this session. But without further ado, we're jumping from Washington, D.C. to Helsinki in Finland. And I'm going to ask my colleague Olivier here in the studio to call on Tina Landau. And Tina is an ESG expert, energy expert, in her own right. But the reason why we're having Tina amongst us today is because she co-authored a superb book published by Palgrave Macmillan literally 6-7 weeks ago. And the title of her book is very catchy, because it says that institutional investors can beat the market with ESG. So it's a very ambitious and optimistic, and I like the title, so that's the reason why we have her today. So I'm going to ask her rhetorically, Tina, how can asset owners, pension investors, and fund management companies, how can they really beat financial markets with ESG? Tina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thanks for making that question. Of course, well, the book is a combination of the latest academic findings, which comes from my co-author's background, who's an associate professor, and then myself, who am an industry expert. I have been working on sustainable investing for many years, leading sustainability investing at a major Finnish pension funds. And now, as mentioned, I work in the industry on the other side. So I joined one of the companies I was analyzing. And well, of course, it's very catchy, as you mentioned. So we are not saying that all and any kind of sustainable investing is always going to beat the market. Of course not. But what we are saying that it is possible, and primarily based on research, there are two strategies that have in the past led to most above the market rate returns. And the first one is if you invest in the best, most sustainable companies in each sector, that has been a winning strategy. And how it has been measured has been based on sustainability ratings. So basically, these ratings, they are a combination of various ESG, so environmental, social, and governance factors. So there can be, you take a combination of how companies are managing child labor risks and environmental topics and carbon footprinting and if they have independent board members and enough and whatnot. So a combination of these things. So obviously, it's a bit more of art than a science. However, it has been working. And the second part is that you are actually engaging with companies. So investors have been promoting sustainability topics and agendas. There can be some kind of gap that they have identified. And as a result, they have actually gone to the companies and told that this is how we want you to change it. You can't just simply make the question or be very specific about your agenda. And according to research, if it has been successful, especially during the first year, it has actually created better returns. So this is what we have seen in the past. And I guess commenting to George's very interesting speech earlier, I want to say that I know that in the US, it's still being discussed of whether considering ESG is violating the fiduciary duty. But obviously we are basically arguing in the book, and I'm arguing today to you the opposite, is that if your fiduciary duty is to make good returns, you need to consider ESG. And it's not just about the ratings and the averages and the engagements. I can also explain this to you in practical terms. So when you think about it, well, let's say when I went to business school, one of my first courses in finance was some 15 years ago, and they told that, basically you just diversify, you invest in many companies and you can manage the risks. Now we all know that there's the kind of mega trends like climate change that can impact all companies in one sector. So if you invest in the energy sector, you cannot diversify climate change away just by, investing in all of the companies. Or even if you select several industries, it's still going to have an impact. And similar with water risks. If there's, one company that uses all the water in the area, the others are going to have a problem as well. It's not just that one company. So basically, if you diversify, maybe all the companies won't have a human rights crisis or a corruption crisis at the same time. However, they can all be impacted by climate change or water scarcity. And that's why if you want to, take care of your fiduciary duty and all of that, it's important to be aware and acknowledge these kind of ESG topics. And that's one of the reasons why we wanted to write the book. So basically we have covered both these aspects. So both, what are the trends and how will they impact? How can leading investors actually make better analysis and consider them? And what is the research saying? And then another topic that I wanted you to understand is that how can you actually, what should you be doing and what should everyone understand about sustainable investing? Yes, I see Nikki in the photo. Do you have some comments?
Yes, and Tina, we have a question for you from the audience, and I'm saluting here the great Bertrand de Mazière, who is jumping into a meeting of his own. À très bientôt. And so, Tina, I had a question for you, because of course you are based in Helsinki. The perception goes, rightly or wrongly, that in Scandinavia in general, and perhaps Sweden, Denmark in particular, people are investors, so asset owners, pension funds, insurance companies, are ahead of the curve in terms of ESG dynamics or greening. Do you think it's really true? Is it more true for investors or corporations, in your personal opinion, in Scandinavia?
Okay, well, I started working as an ESG analyst almost 10 years ago, and already then I was sitting as part of the investment teams and working directly with the portfolio managers, and I think that's been the background in Finland. So from very early on, the ESG experts have been part of the investment teams. And well, let's say the Norwegians, the Swedes, they have started from the other way around. They start thinking of what they don't want to invest in, and later on got to this kind of integrating sustainability and taking these risks into account. So I would say that the Nordics have been quite early on in this. However, now if you look, it's a lot of European countries are actually doing a lot on ESG. The Dutch investors, BGGM and APG, who we have also in the book, by the way, as interviewees and case studies. So they are doing incredible work on how to take, for example, sustainable development investments into account. APG using artificial intelligence to identify new investment opportunities, making information about the impacts public. And also I would say that there's a lot of investors, for example, in the UK who are doing quite a lot. So the Nordics are definitely have been working. We have a long tradition. And of course, that's why bringing these case studies available in the book to everyone has been so important. But I would say that we are not alone on this. So others are also well resourced and very knowledgeable.
Okay, great. Now, perhaps one last quick, because we're receiving questions on YouTube and LinkedIn, but of course we don't have time for all of them. Perhaps just some self-promotion, as you say in French. You could give us, Tina, one more time the proper title of your book, so people watching us online can order it. I'll give you like the last 1 minute to promote your opus. Go ahead, Tina.
Thanks. So the name is Sustainable Investing, Beating the Market with ESG. And maybe one thing to mention is that as I'm an ESG analyst, and when I started, there was no book that I could read. What I did, I went through like 200 pages of methodology documents of what these sustainability ratings are. I read like hundreds of analyses. And I think everybody should kind of understand because the data is necessary to do something, but it's not tell it all. So you cannot know a company sustainability and future just based on the data. So that's why all of this is the best insights from myself and leading experts are in the book. And I'm pretty active on Twitter. So just tag me at Tina Landa on Twitter, and I will answer the rest of the questions that we couldn't make today. So not a problem, and hopefully many of them are also answered in the book.
Merci beaucoup, Tina. It was a pleasure to see you today. And, of course, we're not yet in the post-COVID era. That's why the format today was a hybrid format, and we didn't realize the technological difficulties. We have Jean-Yves and Olivier working around the clock, but having it hybrid with 25 geographies from Vancouver to Helsinki and from the island of Tasmania to London, it was very complicated, lots of technological complexities. So I want to thank you for having stoically forgiven our technological imperfections. But without further ado, now we're moving from Helsinki, Finland to Wall Street, to New York City. And we have the pleasure of welcoming, I'm going to ask Olivier to bring her now on the main board. We have the pleasure of welcoming amongst us today the great Anne Rutledge, who's of course one of the leading thought leaders in the field or on the bloody crossroads where ESG and finance intersect. But she's here today for a short Zoom, no pun intended, but a short Zoom or a short talk focusing specifically on the notion of ESG investment, ESG finance, ESG ratings in relation to the notion of municipal and counties issuers. So, you know, cities, counties, provinces, how do they deal with the notion of ESG at municipal government level? But of course, she's much more knowledgeable than me, so I will yield the floor without further ado to Anne Rutledge in New York City.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. That was such a glowing review. I'm not sure I can live up to it, but I can attest to the blood and scars from the interactions on Wall Street. I'm going to make this very short. The first thing that I need to do is to put some background on our perspective. Our means Credit Spectrum Corp. We are a unregistered, which is not a bad word in the United States, credit rating agency, really focused on holistic analysis of credit quality. We began 20 years ago with the premise that structured finance credit ratings were wrong because they didn't look at time. It was a very technical point of departure. It turned out that that was true. We had a crisis, and the crisis helped, I think, all of us focus on what we weren't looking at. I've heard from my panelists words holistic, alpha or returns, beta, and practical. And what I want to just propose to you today in the next 2 minutes is 2 practical applications of ESG incentives from the top down, because as a Wall Street practitioner and as somebody who has worked with financial institutions who are raising capital or who are investing and want to invest prudently, we have systems in place that are top-down systems. And so no matter how hard we try from the bottom up to make small changes, we are much more effective if the top-down meets the bottom up. And so what we are working on currently is a new type of rating. I know, oh no, another rating, but the idea is to simplify, is to prove out empirically. There's not a lot of empirical research in ratings, contrary to impression, to prove empirically that ESG promotes sustainability. And of course, sustainability is more about beta, right? More about risk than it is about alpha. But if you can embed the beta analysis in the credit rating, you can create incentives for a universe of users. So right now we're working with 1 and potentially 2 universes, sub-universes, and one is European cities who do not have access to municipal finance in the same way that the United States does. We are working to develop what we call smart city ratings, which are dynamic ratings that enable a city to articulate their plan to improve the quality of life, specifically in environmental terms, and then to realize the benefits of that in terms of a cost of capital. A lower cost of capital. That's one path, and it's revolutionary. We were awarded an opportunity to do this through a competition held at the end of last year by South Pole, and we are working with a local partner in the north of Spain who is being funded by Kick Climate to roll that out. Separately, we are in negotiations with a supply chain trade finance web that want to do exactly the same thing. They want to bring first of all, into the analysis of credit quality, where we would be providing the ratings. So those are the 2 bits of information and ideas that I have to share today.
Things from a Santander perspective.
And I'm happy to take questions.
Elaborate, because she had so much. With Shelley can hear us, I think he had a few questions for the audience. Nick? Okay, yeah.
Hi there.
Hi, Nick. Perfect.
great to hear and see from you again, Anne. I just appreciate your perspective. I think you can hear me okay?
Very clearly.
Great.
Hi, Nick.
Just appreciate your perspective. I reflect back on the global financial crisis and the role of credit rating agencies during that period. Do you have any reflections on their failings in some cases?
Not only do I have reflections, but I have scars.
We all do.
We do indeed. My firm played a very active role in helping investors recoup damages and in analyzing the various, deconstructing what kind of bad actions took place. And I think there's plenty to share. But specifically I don't want to
learn. They've learned the lessons?
Well, I think they've learned some lessons, but I think the main lesson that they learned was not to experiment, not to innovate. Because, from my perspective, everybody knows I'm very candid. From my perspective, the derivative, the movement into synthetic credits, and the repackaging of off-balance sheet finance securities in a corporate format was bad faith. It was characterized as innovation. It was nothing of the sort. It was a way of legally breaking some rules that the rating agencies knew, that the market probably knew, and it didn't work out well. And so the lesson learned was, don't try anything new. And I think that the evidence for the fact that the rating agencies have pulled back in their willingness to understand and accommodate the market, except in one respect, which I'll talk about in a minute. I think the evidence is the rise of private equity and the role of private equity in private credit. Because the market, everybody needs capital. There are, on both sides, people need new products to invest in, and people need working capital to keep going and, build their businesses and feed their families. And I think the rating agency role in there has decreased dramatically because of the crisis. But I think that another point was that the credit rating agencies became much more sensitive to their own investors. They had been private companies. The big ones are now public companies. They have investors and shareholders to take care of. And so for them, one way to innovate is to build their own capital base by buying companies like ESG companies. That to me is not necessarily meeting the needs of the market, but it may be meeting the needs of their investors.
I was going to come to that trend. We're having appropriate and a massive major debate about ESG investment. It's a central feature of this conference and many more. Do you have any observations to make about the rigor of the implementation of a whole raft of projects, together with claims that are being made about, in some cases, I think very dubious, about their contribution to net carbon, zero carbon emissions?
Oh, thank you for the invitation to criticize. What I would say is that we are at a very, a profoundly important moment in time where, whereas I may be the first voice to say something critical, I think we have a universe of investors who understand finance very, very well, who understand, they may not know science as well, but who understand knowledge building. I think we have a world of critics. And I think that the development or the incorporation of ESG into credit ratings is going to be happening in public. And this was not true of the rating process itself. The development of ratings that we all take for granted, none of us ever really saw it happening. Those of us who worked inside a rating agency have had an advantage in some sense because we know what goes on behind the scenes, some of it good, some of it not good. But here, the debate is happening in public. And I think the more public it is and the more diverse diversity of minds that we have making those arguments, the better we're going to be. But I think we have to do it pretty fast also.
Yeah, I think certainly a concern I have is the level of reliability of some of the programs and claims that are being made about some of the programs. And you know, I'm reasonably optimistic about the stated goal. I'm a lot more concerned about underneath the way in which it's going to or isn't going to be delivered, and the robustness of the process and the claims that are being made.
You know, I have to speak from my own business perspective. We believe in building systems that have high standards that are locally customized. And I don't understand how you can have a system of governance that isn't dynamic, that doesn't respond to feedback, that isn't continuously improving. And so to me, the very first thing that one needs to do is to have an objective body evaluate the claims. But I think a second thing that one needs to do, and that's what we're working on, is to find an alternative path that actually incorporates the two and tests out, you know, should a company or a city be a beneficiary of a better cost of capital while doing bad things? I think there's a lot of relationship. Sorry.
Yeah, one final question. I mean, there's a lot of focus on the role of pension funds and their trustees or boards of governors, whatever we call them. Do you have any observations to make about the development of the oversight of ESG by the range of different governance authorities of pension funds, particularly in the US, but more generally?
Oh, Nick, I'm probably not qualified to answer that point, but I will say that I am personally involved in financial education and in developing content for those bodies to consider, because I think that it's sort of the pension lobby is very big, and the amount of money at stake could change anything overnight. But the assimilation and filtering of information that needs to get there is a very slow process. So I think that some education is needed to accelerate that process.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's an interesting, fascinating area. Australia, for example, has come a long way, and its pension funds are truly massive, and it's a large system, so the impact can be profound. And I reflect back to my early days in the late 1980s as a pension fund trustee, when these issues were not even thought of. But we've come a long way, but it seems to me it's still, we're certainly not perfect in Australia, but it seems to me that I was looking at a survey in the UK, for example, where 1/3 of trustees don't take ESG overlay into account yet in terms of their governance approach. I don't know what, I haven't seen data in the US or other big pension fund systems. Any observations about these trends?
Again, I don't believe that I'm qualified to comment, but I certainly would love to see a case study of what you've done in Australia. Yeah. Because I think people are struggling for models. This is what we're doing in Smart City, is we're taking a model of a smart city that was extraordinary 30 years ago and is a leader. Clearly Australia is a leader in this regard, so we need to learn from you.
We've still got a lot to learn. I have to confess, we've just signed up to net zero, our Prime Minister, at last, as of last week, but it's been a long, tortuous process and pathway. I think I'm getting a signal, so thanks very much, Anne, and back to Nick, you there in Paris.
Thank you for your attendance. Okay, sorry, I am back. I'm back. And I was thinking with Chris Smith, who you don't see, but he sends his regards. I was thinking that, you know, having the pleasure, having you guys, and maybe we can allocate impromptu, as we say in French, the last 8 minutes of your segment to basically pick your brains so you can sit here maybe facing them, Chris, but pick your brains about the notion of S and ESG. So how do you see in Canberra, Melbourne, Washington, DC, Helsinki, New York, so how do you see that interaction? So how do you see people in your different geographies integrating the social aspects of ESG? Is it true that the COVID crisis has acted as a catalyst? So perhaps we can have a quick exchange of views with Josh first, then Chris, then Anne, and then maybe Tina if she wants to say a few words. And we'll allocate the last 7 minutes on that. So starting perhaps with Josh, Nick, Chris, and Tina, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So actually, if I could just answer what Nick was asked, Nick Sherry was asking just previously about what we're seeing in terms of trustees. We have been seeing with our collegial organizations that deal with trustee training a notable uptick in the level of trustee training around ESG, probably over the past decade. And so that's something that we're certainly keeping an eye on, because as many of you on the call know, at least in the public pension space, these are all governed by 50 separate state entities. The federal government has essentially no role in it, and so there certainly has been more trustee training and trustee focus by the groups that provide the education to what oftentimes are not financial professionals, but are retired teachers or public safety professionals, and sort of bringing them into the fold in terms of understanding of the ESG concepts and evaluation approaches. We're definitely seeing an uptick in that space. As I mentioned before, like I think we've been noting, along with our colleagues at Boston College, is that a lot of attention is given to, and with the S and then the E and G as well, a lot of attention is given to plans, on the coast from California and New York and down the coast. But 2/3 of the plans in our public plans database are using some form of ESG filter for their investments. So I think the picture is not always painted as accurately as you might think, but we certainly see increased focus going forward. Yeah, so I'll stop there.
Just a quick observation from myself, from an Australian perspective, on the social in ESG. And we've had some really fascinating impacts in that space. And I'm sure most of our audience would have heard of the Rio case involving the destruction of sensitive Aboriginal sites, caves, as part of a mining operation. It got very adverse publicity globally for Rio, and the pension funds, not just the pension funds in Australia, but a whole range of financial institutions. I think there's some important lessons for behaviours that Rio indulged in, and I think those lessons have been learnt well and truly, and I think it's part of that social approach of pension funds. The couple of other interesting areas I think that they do relate also to governance, but executive salaries. I think there's been a significant impact on inappropriate bonuses, executive salaries, and certainly in the Australian context. Gender equity hasn't been as much progress as you would hope in Australia in terms of women on boards, but certainly at senior executive positions. But I'd hate to think where we were if it wasn't for the activity of our pension fund trustees. So I think in that social space, I know we're rightly focused on environmental issues in the run-up to COP26, but I think these other social impacts, paying decent minimum wages. Australia has a strong minimum wage system, but unfortunately some employers breach. And again, the pension funds have paid this area a lot of attention. So I think that social in the broad ESG perspective can have a really, really important impact. But I'll finish my comments there and hand over to Tina and others.
Yeah, thanks. I actually agree with the original comment that, you know, the social part has kind of been the weakest link, like the least in the focus. There has been these individual cases where investors have engaged, for example, on technology companies and how to limit the social media use of their kids to avoid negative impacts. And of course, if, you know, somebody's, like we have a case in the book about scrapping ships in poor conditions, so that has been gone to the investor agenda for engagements. But now I think with the increase in legislation on human rights and making it mandatory for companies to actually do due diligence, so actually assess the human rights impacts on their whole value chains, and they can even in the future maybe be sued in more places if they are not doing what they should. So I think that has kind of made a difference. So now it's been more a focus of also some investors to try to look at human rights more proactively. And the other thing is the diversity, as was also mentioned. There's big investors such as BlackRock who has approached companies that they should have more diversified boards and the top executives. So, and also there's at the same time there has been some studies finding that companies with diversified boards are more successful also. So I think this is increasing. And also, if you think about the COVID, there has been countries and companies that haven't really managed everything so well. So they have, maybe somebody has been forced to work when they have been ill, or maybe some others have had to work overtime really a lot when others have been sick. So this has become more of an acute issue, and also how the companies have maybe contributed to the whole crisis and how prepared they are. So I think, yeah, definitely. Finally, we are seeing that the social part of ESG is also rising in significance and attention as it should be.
Yeah, and just two other topics that we haven't brought up yet under the S category is data protection and privacy considerations, and then also employee engagement, especially as Nick mentioned, coming out of the pandemic, and that also is getting a lot more attention as well. So those are two other layers that I think are important as well.
Definitely agree with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so we have definitely seen in Westminster local government pension scheme an increased training, not just for the trustees, but for the board members as well, who scrutinise what is being done. And those board members are part of what's known as the London Civ. So the 32 London boroughs have got together, 40 billion under investment or that sort of numbers. And the local authorities have actually started looking at their own work in terms of ensuring the gender pay gap is being decreased, the race pay gap is being decreased, and also scrutinising those companies using metrics that are easily understandable. One thing that I want to be everyone to be aware of is greenwashing. So what is greenwashing? It's those companies using certain parts of those metrics which make the companies look better, investing in them. And we need some kind of detailed risk assessment across the board that everyone can agree with, so that we don't get that greenwashing. But I am seeing improvements. What's COVID done? More people are working from home. It's improving their work-life balance, and that has been really useful, particularly towards people with childcare responsibilities, the majority who are women. That's all I'd like to say at this moment in time.
Great. Well, I can hear quite a bit of noise. I suspect people are coming back from lunch, which I'm sadly missing out on here in Tasmania. I'm sure I've had a quick supper, but nothing to match the gastronomical delights of Paris, which I've sadly missed out on this year, but I'll be there next year. look, I think a good discussion. It's such a huge area, the social. Just one, just reflecting before I finish on that last comment about working from home. We're seeing some really interesting mixes, ups and downs emerge. Homeschooling is a nightmare. I've got to say, I went through it for a month. Some of you may be aware, Melbourne, the city of Melbourne in Australia has had the longest lockdown of any city in the world. And some of my friends that I communicate with, because the kids haven't been at school for months and months, this year and last year. Yeah. It's been actually quite a challenge making those sorts of adjustments. So it's got some two sides to the coin elements that are not necessarily great. But that's it from me, and I think hope my co-chair Nick Bursley is about to segue. I can see a Nick pose. There he is. Nick, over to you.
I would like to thank the Right Honourable Nick Cherry from Devonport, Tasmania. It was a great session with Chris Smith, and I can see that on the screen. We still have from Washington, D.C., Josh Frenzel and Tina Landau from Helsinki. Great session. And Olivier and I, we just had our 3 minutes lunch break. So unlike the privileged French aristocrats and bourgeois capitalists, we, the working class, with the help of Nick Silver and Chris Smith, we had just a 4 or 5 minutes lunch break. But it was a pleasure. It was eye candy and ear candy for us to have you with us today. And hopefully when that COVID, I know that Australia was really one of the toughest, Singapore, as Vincent knows, Singapore and Australia had some of the toughest COVID travel regulation strictures and quarantine, to use a French word, quarantine laws and regulations. As these laws are progressively being loosened, and in spite of last bits, but as the laws progressively are loosened, including in London, we hope that in the coming weeks, hopefully by early January, the travel situation, with these corridors that the Australians and Singaporeans and the Japanese are opening up. So these corridors will allow us to have the pleasure to welcome in the flesh the Honourable Nick Cherry at our next G7 and/or G20 Pensions conference in Paris or Singapore in the coming quarters. Once again, it was a pleasure to have you. And as we say in French, à très bientôt.